At 9:38 in the morning on July 25, 1944, the first fighter bombers appeared over Normandy. Within minutes, the sky turned black with aircraft. 1,500 heavy bombers of the United States 8th Air Force appeared over a narrow rectangle of French farmland, their engines creating a thunder that German soldiers on the ground could feel in their chests before they could see anything at all. Below them, dug into the hedgerows along the Saint-Lô to Perrier's road, the men of Panzer Lehr Division looked upward and understood that something terrible was about to happen. The bombs did not stop falling for nearly 2 hours. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzer Lehr, watched from his command post as wave after wave of bombers passed overhead. He counted them coming, as if on a conveyor belt, one formation after another stretching to the horizon. 843 B-17 Flying Fortresses, 647 B-24 Liberators, nearly 400 medium bombers and fighter bombers. Approximately 3,000 aircraft in total, releasing over 3,300 tons of high explosives and napalm onto an area measuring 6,000 yards by 2,200 yards. The Earth itself seemed to rise and fall in waves. Craters overlapped craters until the landscape resembled the surface of the moon. Bayerlein would later use exactly that word, Mondlandschaft, moonscape. But what happened next was what truly broke the German defense. The moment the last bombs fell, before the dust could settle, before survivors could emerge from whatever shelter they had found, American artillery opened fire. Not scattered guns firing independently, but hundreds of tubes speaking as one, their shells arriving in a continuous storm that gave no pause, no moment to reorganize, no chance to breathe. This was not coincidence. This was coordination, and it was something the German army had never faced before. The system that destroyed Panzer Lehr that morning was built on a technology that weighed 32 pounds and fit in a canvas pack on a soldier's back. The SCR-300 radio, developed by the Galvin Manufacturing Company, later known as Motorola, represented a revolution in military communications that would change the nature of warfare itself. Unlike every radio the German army possessed, the SCR-300 used frequency modulation rather than amplitude modulation. This seemingly technical distinction meant everything on the battlefield. Frequency modulation rejected the static and interference that plagued amplitude modulation sets. It worked clearly inside tanks and vehicles where engine noise made German radios nearly useless. It allowed multiple radios to operate on adjacent frequencies without drowning each other out. And it provided crystal-clear voice communication even in the chaos of combat, when a forward observer needed to call artillery fire onto a target that was trying to kill him. The United States Army fielded approximately 50,000 SCR-300 radios during the war. They issued them down to company and battalion level, giving every American infantry commander the ability to speak directly with higher headquarters, adjacent units, and supporting artillery in real time. The German army, by contrast, relied primarily on wire telephone communications, with radios as backup. German infantry platoons generally had no radios at all. They communicated through runners, hand signals, and flares, the same methods their fathers had used in the trenches of the First World War. But the radio was only part of the system. The true innovation was what happened when a soldier keyed his microphone and requested fire support. At the United States Army Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, a quiet revolution had taken place during the 1930s. 3 officers, Major Carlos Brewer, Major Orlando Ward, and Lieutenant Colonel H.L.C. Jones, developed a concept that no other army in the world would match during the Second World War. They called it the Fire Direction Center. The problem they solved was simple to state, but enormously difficult in practice. How do you coordinate the fire of dozens or hundreds of artillery pieces, located in different positions, to strike a single target at the same moment? The traditional method required each battery commander to calculate his own firing solutions independently, a slow process that made rapid massing of fires nearly impossible. The Fort Sill innovators centralized this function. A fire direction center received target information from forward observers via radio, plotted the target on a standardized firing chart, calculated firing data for every battery in range using a device called a graphical firing table, and transmitted the solutions to the guns. The entire process, from a forward observer's initial call to rounds leaving the tubes, could be completed in approximately 3 minutes. The German army conducted fire direction at the battery level. A German forward observer had authority only over his own battery and could not spontaneously mass fire from multiple battalions. German response time was approximately 10 to 12 minutes, and even then, only a single battery would fire. The difference sounds technical. On the battlefield, it was the difference between life and death. By 1944, the war in Europe had reached a decisive phase. The Allied invasion at Normandy on June 6 had succeeded in establishing a beachhead, but 7 weeks later, the front lines had barely moved. The Norman hedgerows, those ancient earthen walls topped with dense vegetation that divided every field from its neighbour, had turned the campaign into a bloody stalemate. Each hedgerow was a natural fortress. Each field was a killing ground. American forces measured their advances in hundreds of yards per day, paying for every gain with heavy casualties. The German forces defending Normandy were some of the finest remaining in the Wehrmacht. Panzer Lehr Division was considered an elite formation, originally created to demonstrate armoured tactics to foreign visitors. Its tank crews were instructors, its officers were professionals, and its equipment was first-rate. But Panzer Lehr, like every German unit in France, suffered from a crippling disadvantage that no amount of courage or skill could overcome. They could not communicate. Allied air supremacy meant that any German vehicle moving in daylight attracted immediate attack from prowling fighter bombers. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel understood these implications better than most. He wrote during the campaign that anyone who has to fight, even with the most modern weapons, against an enemy in complete command of the air, fights like a savage against modern European troops, under the same handicaps and with the same chances of success. Rommel was describing his own forces, crippled by Allied air power, unable to move or communicate effectively. Telephone wires laid across the French countryside were cut within hours by bombs or strafing runs. Radio transmissions revealed the location of headquarters, inviting destruction. A German after-action report from Normandy stated the problem bluntly. Wire connections in the battle area break down to the point of uselessness. The remaining options were primitive. Motorcycle messengers, officers in staff cars risking the roads, runners on foot. In the time it took a German commander to send a message and receive a reply, an American forward observer could call in multiple artillery strikes and adjust fire onto targets of opportunity. On the morning of July 25, Panzer Lehr Division held positions along the St. Lo to Perrier's Road at the western edge of the American line. The previous day, July 24, American forces had attempted to launch Operation Cobra, but poor weather caused the attack to be postponed after some bombs had already fallen. Bayerlein observed American infantry pulling back from their forward positions along the road and made a fateful decision. He moved his troops forward into the vacated American positions, exactly where the bombing was planned to fall. The Germans spent the night of July 24 digging in. They had no idea they had walked into a trap. The morning of July 25 dawned clear. Weather conditions were acceptable. At American headquarters, the orders went out. For the men of Panzer Lehr, the day began like any other in the hedgerows. Soldiers checked their weapons. Officers reviewed their defensive positions. Some men wrote letters home. Others tried to catch what sleep they could in their foxholes. The guns were quiet. The sky was empty. It was, in its terrible way, a beautiful summer morning. Bayerlein later described what followed in testimony to American interrogators after the war. His words remain among the most vivid first-hand accounts of what coordinated firepower could do to a military formation. The bombers came as if on a conveyor belt, he said. Back and forth the carpets were laid. Artillery positions were wiped out. Tanks overturned and buried. Infantry positions flattened. All roads and tracks destroyed. By midday, the entire area resembled a moonscape, with bomb craters touching rim to rim. All signal communications had been cut, and no command was possible. The shock effect on the troops was indescribable. Several of my men went mad and rushed round in the open until they were cut down by splinters. But Bayerlein noted something else, something that revealed the true nature of the American system. Simultaneously with the storm from the air, innumerable guns of American artillery poured drumfire into our positions. This was the critical detail. The bombing and the artillery were synchronized. The moment one form of destruction ended, another began. There was no pause, no respite, and no opportunity for survivors to reorganize or take stock of their situation. The American system had turned multiple weapon systems into a single, continuous killing mechanism. Bayerlein estimated his losses at roughly 50% from bombing, 30% from artillery, and 20% from other weapons. He reported to his superiors that Panzer Lehr was finally annihilated. The numbers confirmed his assessment. Panzer Lehr had entered the bombardment with approximately 2,200 combat troops, 12 operational Panzer, 4 tanks, and 16 Panthers. After the barrage, roughly 1,000 had become casualties. Bayerlein reported that only a handful of tanks remained operational in the immediate combat area. He later stated that over 70% of his soldiers were either dead, wounded, crazed, or numb. The tragedy of Operation Cobra extended to American forces as well. On both July 24 and July 25, some bombs fell short of their intended targets. 111 American soldiers were killed by their own aircraft, including Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater. 490 more were wounded, but the German defense had been shattered. Major General J. Lawton Collins of the 7th Corps, known as Lightning Joe for his aggressive tactics in the Pacific, gambled by committing his armor on July 26, despite uncertainty about German resistance. His tanks advanced 7 miles that day at the cost of only 3 vehicles destroyed. By July 28, organized German resistance in the sector had collapsed. The breakout from Normandy had begun. The destruction of Panzer Lehr was not an isolated incident. It was the first large-scale demonstration of a system that would dominate the remaining months of the war in Europe. To understand why German troops came to fear the sound of an American radio more than any individual weapon, it is necessary to understand how this system worked in practice. The heart of American coordination was the forward observer. A typical forward observer team consisted of a junior lieutenant, a sergeant, a radioman, and wiremen as needed. They carried an SCR 609 or 610 radio, binoculars, maps, compasses, and standardized call for fire sheets. These small teams were assigned from artillery battalions to the infantry companies that most needed support. Their lives were measured in days rather than weeks, for they operated at the very front of the battle, exposed to enemy fire while directing death onto the enemy. The fire mission procedure followed a standardized sequence that every artilleryman knew by heart. The forward observer identified himself on the radio net, issued the warning order fire mission, transmitted target coordinates and azimuth, described the target, and specified whether he would adjust. The Fire Direction Center calculated firing data and relayed it to the batteries. 2 guns fired, adjusting rounds. The forward observer watched where the shells landed and sent corrections. The process repeated until rounds were on target, at which point the observer called fire for effect, bringing all available guns to bear. The speed of this process astonished German soldiers who experienced it. American response time from fire request to rounds on target was approximately 3 minutes for a direct support battalion. Adding division-level assets took an additional 3 minutes. Corps-level massed fire could be delivered in roughly 9 minutes total. No German commander could mount a counterattack, move reserves, or even withdraw his men in 9 minutes. By the time a German officer recognized the threat and began issuing orders, American shells were already falling. The Fire Direction Center architecture amplified this capability exponentially. FDCs existed at battery, battalion, division artillery, and corps levels, all connected by radio. A silence is consent rule meant that if a higher FDC did not cancel a mission, it proceeded automatically. Any forward observer could potentially call fire from any battery in range. A single lieutenant with a radio could, in principle, bring the weight of an entire corps artillery to bear on his target. The 48 artillery tubes of a single American infantry division were available to support any unit, even a patrol. At the Battle of the Bulge, 348 guns, plus a battalion of 4.2-inch mortars from 4 divisions, were coordinated under a single assistant division commander. For the 9th Army Rhine Crossing, 2,070 guns delivered 1,000 rounds per minute. No other artillery in the world could do that. The technique called time on target represented the pinnacle of this coordination. TOT, synchronized shells from batteries at different ranges and calibers to arrive on the target simultaneously, within plus or minus 3 seconds of the designated impact time. The process required the Fire Direction Center to calculate each battery's unique time of flight based on range, charge, elevation, and ballistic conditions, then broadcast a countdown so each battery fired at precisely staggered moments. The effect was devastating. A post-war United States Army study confirmed that at the moment of artillery impact, 58% of soldiers in the open are still standing. Within 2 seconds, only 29% remain standing. After 8 seconds, all are prone seeking cover. Traditional artillery with spotting rounds followed by adjustment gave defenders precious seconds to take shelter. Time on target eliminated this window entirely. There were no warning shots. The first sound was the detonation of dozens or hundreds of shells simultaneously. German prisoners consistently attested to the catastrophic effects. Officers who planned surprise attacks assumed they would have 15 to 20 minutes free of defensive fire, while American artillery adjusted. Instead, they found immediate, accurately placed fire on their troops at the start line. German prisoners frequently asked to see the automatic cannons, unable to believe human effort could produce such volumes of fire. Even German soldiers who criticized American infantry, who considered them inexperienced or lacking in tactical skill compared to Wehrmacht veterans, consistently praised and feared the artillery. One American officer captured this dynamic succinctly when he wrote that we let the artillery fight the war as much as possible. It was not cowardice, it was efficiency. Why send infantry into a position that artillery could destroy from miles away? The German army had its own skilled artillerists. German guns were well designed and their crews were professional, but the organizational structure prevented them from matching American capabilities. German artillery supporting 5th Panzer Army in Normandy could fire only about 10% of what British forces fired, and the British fired less than the Americans. Commanders frequently limited fire to 1 or 2 shots per battery, 1 battery per mission, simply because they lacked the shells for anything more. Historians have estimated that Germany produced fewer artillery shells in the entire Second World War than it had in the First World War. The industrial pressure of fighting on multiple fronts, combined with Allied bombing of production facilities and the diversion of resources to tanks, aircraft, and other weapons, left the artillery chronically short of ammunition. American forces faced no such constraints. The shells flowed from American factories in quantities that seemed inexhaustible to German soldiers who counted every round. 2 weeks after Operation Cobra demonstrated the offensive potential of American coordination, the defensive application was proven with equal force at the Battle of Mortain. On August 7, 1944, Adolf Hitler ordered a major counterattack through the town of Mortain toward the coastal city of Avranches. If successful, the attack would cut off General George Patton's Third Army, which had broken through the German lines and was racing across France. Hitler assembled approximately 26,000 troops in the first attack echelon and nearly 300 tanks and assault guns from 4 panzer divisions for the assault. Ultra-intelligence intercepts provided warning of the attack, though the full tactical details arrived at 1st Army headquarters too late to alert all frontline units. The 30th Infantry Division held Mortain, and approximately 700 men of the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, defended the dominant terrain feature, a rocky prominence known as Hill 314. The decisive weapon on Hill 314 was not a gun or a tank. It was a pair of forward observer teams from the 230th Field Artillery Battalion. First, Lieutenant Charles A. Bartz and Second Lieutenant Robert L. Weiss positioned themselves near the summit with FM radios and a commanding view of German approach routes for miles in every direction. When the German attack came around 0100 hours on August 7th, Lieutenant Weiss could not see the approaching enemy through darkness and fog. He could hear them. He radioed coordinates based on sound alone, and American artillery shells rained down on the Germans. The attack was beaten off without the observers ever seeing their targets. For 5 days, the pattern repeated. Every time German forces assembled for an attack, the forward observers on Hill 314 called down artillery fire that broke up the formations before they could close. Sergeant Frank Denius from one of the observer teams recalled the experience simply. You could see the attack coming. I would just put as much artillery into the area as I could. The 2 forward observer teams on Hill 314 had special high priority from 7th Corps Heavy Artillery for fire missions around the clock. This meant that when they called for fire, their requests took precedence over almost any other mission in the sector. The hilltop position gave them observation over German movements for miles in every direction, along every road, and through every village the attackers would have to use. The Germans understood the importance of the hill. They attacked it repeatedly, committing tank and infantry forces that should have been pushing toward Avranches. Each attack was met with the same devastating response. Artillery shells crashed into the assault formations while they were still assembling. Those that pressed forward were cut apart by the American infantry defending the perimeter and the continuous artillery support those infantry called down on their positions. The greatest threat was not German firepower but battery depletion for the radios. Without working radios, the forward observers could not call fire, and the hill would fall. Lieutenant Colonel Louis D. Veeman, commanding the 230th Field Artillery Battalion, devised an ingenious solution. He packed medical supplies and fresh batteries into empty artillery, smoke shell casings, and fired them into the American perimeter on Hill 314. The results were mixed, with some supplies scattered too far to recover, but the improvised resupply helped keep the radios working for the duration of the siege. The men on Hill 314 had no armor support. They had no heavy weapons except what they could carry. They had limited food and water, and no hope of ground resupply, while Germans surrounded them. What they had were radios and the artillery those radios could summon. For 5 days, surrounded and under constant attack, that was enough. When relief finally came on August 12th, the survivors walked off Hill 314 having held a position that should have been impossible to defend. They had demonstrated, more clearly than any tactical manual could express, that in modern warfare the ability to communicate was the most decisive weapon of all. The defense cost over 300 of the 700 defenders killed or wounded, but it completely halted the left wing of the German counterattack. Air support compounded the ground defense. RAF Typhoons flew 294 sorties on August 7th alone. The combined air, artillery, infantry defense shattered Operation Lutich. The failure at Mortain led directly to one of the greatest German disasters of the war. With their forces committed to the counterattack, German units were now vulnerable to encirclement. American and British forces closed from north and south, trapping much of the German army in France in what became known as the Falaise Pocket. The killing ground at Falaise between August 12th and 21st, 1944, demonstrated the full horror of what coordinated firepower could do to a trapped army. On August 18th, a day that became known as the Shambles, Allied aircraft flew over 1,300 sorties against German columns, trying to escape through the narrowing gap. Typhoons and Thunderbolts queued up over the pocket, waiting their turn to attack. Pilots described roads so clogged with burning vehicles that new attacks had to target the fields beside them where Germans were trying to flee. Fighter bombers attacked continuously from first light until darkness made further operations impossible. The aircraft worked in relays, each flight expending its ordnance before returning to base to rearm, while another flight took its place. The columns below had nowhere to hide. Roads through the pocket were too narrow and too choked with wrecked vehicles to permit dispersal. Men who abandoned their vehicles and fled into the fields were strafed as they ran. Final totals at Falaise reached 5,644 destroyed, damaged, or abandoned German vehicles, including 358 tanks and self-propelled guns. German casualties reached 10,000 to 15,000 killed and 40,000 to 50,000 captured. The Wehrmacht lost the equivalent of approximately 50 divisions in the Normandy campaign, losses from which it would never recover. General Dwight D. Eisenhower walked the battlefield afterward and wrote that the scenes could be described only by Dante. The smell of death hung over the area for weeks. Horses, vehicles, tanks, and men lay tangled together in the ditches and fields, mute testimony to what coordinated firepower could accomplish when an army was trapped without the ability to communicate or maneuver. The air component of American coordination evolved through its own painful learning process. In North Africa, in 1942 and early 1943, American air-ground cooperation had been dismal. Air assets were parceled out to individual ground commanders, resulting in piecemeal employment and ineffective support. The Kasserine Pass debacle in February 1943 exposed every failure of this approach. The solution came in doctrine. On July 21, 1943, the United States Army published Field Manual 120, Command and Employment of Air Power. Its first principle stated in capital letters that land power and air power are co-equal and interdependent forces, neither is an auxiliary of the other. This document, known as the Declaration of Independence for Tactical Air Power, established centralized control of air assets with decentralized execution. Major General Elwood R. Quesada, commander of the 9th Tactical Air Command supporting 1st Army, was the innovator who turned doctrine into battlefield reality. Quesada flew into Normandy the day after D-Day and established his headquarters directly beside Bradley's command post. This physical proximity was not ceremonial. It meant that air and ground commanders ate together, planned together, and understood each other's problems in ways that no amount of written communication could achieve. Quesada fostered the close personal relationship between air and ground commanders that effective coordination demanded. His innovations transformed air-ground operations. Quesada placed aircraft VHF radios into Sherman tanks, enabling forward controllers to speak directly with pilots overhead. Fighter-bomber pilots served as ground controllers, understanding exactly what information pilots needed to identify targets. He developed the Armored Column Cover System, first employed on July 26 during the Cobra breakout. 4 P47 Thunderbolts maintained continuous cover over advancing armored columns, controlled by a forward air control party riding in the lead tank via radio. When no immediate targets existed, the aircraft scanned up to 30 miles ahead of the column. The Republic P47 Thunderbolt was the primary instrument of this destruction. Powered by a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2 800 double wasp radial engine, it carried 850 caliber machine guns with 3,400 rounds and up to 2,500 pounds of bombs, napalm, and rockets. Its air-cooled engine gave it legendary survivability, able to absorb battle damage that would have destroyed liquid-cooled fighters. Pilots returned to base, trailing smoke and oil, their aircraft riddled with holes, engines still running. Luftwaffe ace Heinz Bahr, who flew captured American aircraft and understood their capabilities intimately, noted that the P-47 could absorb an astounding amount of lead and had to be handled very carefully in combat. The armored column cover flights arrived every 30 minutes, providing constant coverage throughout daylight hours. The forward air control parties in the lead tanks, designated by call signs like Rover Joe, could vector aircraft onto targets within seconds of spotting resistance. The system created a continuous umbrella of firepower that preceded every American armored advance. The Ronce Column attack on July 29, 1944, demonstrated the devastating potential of coordinated air power. P-47s of the 405th Fighter Group spotted a 3-mile German column trapped between Ronce and Saint-Denis-le-Vêtu. From 15:10 hours until 21:40 hours, they systematically bombed and strafed, returning to base to rearm between attacks. Post-war ground investigation found 66 tanks, 204 vehicles, and 11 artillery pieces destroyed along that road. Between D-Day and VE Day, P-47 pilots claimed 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles, and 68,000 trucks destroyed. While wartime pilot claims consistently exceeded verified figures by substantial margins, even conservative estimates confirmed the Thunderbolt as the most effective ground attack aircraft of the war. German commanders left extensive testimony about the impact of American coordination. Field Marshal Rommel noted the great superiority in artillery and outstandingly large supply of ammunition that American forces possessed. Field Marshal Hans Gunther von Kluge, who succeeded Rommel as commander of German forces in the West, stated that in the face of total enemy air superiority, we can adopt no tactics to compensate for the annihilating power of air, except to retire from the battlefield. Fritz Bayerlein, reflecting on the summer of 1944, delivered perhaps the most telling comparison. Not even the battles of annihilation of the 1940 Blitzkrieg in France, or in 1941 in Russia, can approach the Battle of Annihilation in France in 1944 in the magnitude of their planning, the logic of their execution, the collaboration of sea, air, and ground forces. German soldiers developed their own vocabulary for the American coordinated firepower they faced. Jabo, short for Jagd bomber, meaning fighter bomber, became the generic and deeply feared term for Allied tactical aircraft. Jabo Todd, death by Jabo, was slang for the common fate of being killed by fighter bombers. The warning cry Achtung Jabo sent men diving for whatever cover they could find. Veterans recalled that the mere sound of aircraft engines overhead could paralyze entire columns, with men abandoning vehicles and scattering into fields and ditches even before bombs began to fall. The psychological effect of constant air attack compounded the physical destruction. German prisoners consistently remarked on the heavy volume of American fire they experienced. Compiled veteran accounts describe Americans as having a disposition to aggression never seen in any other nation's sons, who would immediately return fire, bring a punishing rain of artillery or air power on top of whatever they were fighting, and move to counterattack as soon as the rain of death ended. One detail appeared repeatedly in German accounts. The sound that German soldiers feared most was not the whistle of incoming shells or the roar of diving aircraft. It was the crackle of an American walkie-talkie. That sound meant overwhelming, accurate firepower was seconds away. Germany could never close the communications gap for fundamental structural reasons. American quartz crystal production, essential for every radio set, reached 1 million units per month by the war's end. The program received the second highest manufacturing priority after the Manhattan Project. Motorola alone produced 50,000 SCR-300s and 130,000 SCR-536s. The United States Signal Corps grew from 27,000 to 350,000 personnel during the war, a 12-fold increase that reflected the importance of communications to American strategy. Germany never adopted frequency modulation for tactical radios. When engineers finally began developing FM sets late in the war, it was far too late to matter. Allied strategic bombing disrupted German electronics production. Forced labor in German factories produced sabotage and quality control problems. When Germans captured American radios in Sicily, they were deeply impressed but could not replicate FM production at scale. German ammunition constraints were equally devastating and contributed to their tactical paralysis. German artillery supporting 5th Panzer Army in Normandy could fire only about 10% of what British forces fired, and the British fired less than the Americans. Commanders frequently limited fire to 1 or 2 shots per battery, 1 battery per mission. The American system was not invincible. The Hurtgen Forest campaign from September 1944 through February 1945 provided a brutal counterpoint to the success in open terrain. In dense forest that negated observation, limited radio range, and prevented air support, German forces fought American troops to near standstill. The trees that blocked observation also turned artillery into a weapon against its users, as shells detonated on contact with branches and showered fragments downward onto attacking Americans. The 22nd Infantry Regiment suffered approximately 2,800 casualties, advancing 6,000 yards, a casualty rate exceeding 85%. Where terrain broke the American network, the advantage vanished completely. The Hurtgen Forest demonstrated that the American system required observation, communication, and maneuver space to function. Without these elements, American forces fought on equal terms, and equal terms against German defenders in prepared positions meant horrific casualties. But the Hurtgen Forest was the exception that proved the rule. In open country, in the hedgerows when coordination was possible, on the roads and fields of France and Belgium and Germany, the American system produced results that no amount of German tactical skill or individual courage could effectively counter. The proximity fuse represented another American technological advantage that multiplied the effect of artillery coordination. Codenamed POSIT by the Army and VT by the Navy, this device used a tiny radio transmitter and receiver to detect when a shell was within lethal range of the ground, detonating it at that moment to shower everything below with shrapnel. The fuse contained a miniature vacuum tube, a remarkable feat of engineering that allowed complex electronics to survive the tremendous acceleration of being fired from a cannon. Traditional artillery shells had to strike the ground to explode, and their fragments sprayed outward in a cone. Men in foxholes were relatively safe from traditional shells. The proximity fuse eliminated this protection entirely. Shells detonating overhead drove fragments downward into positions that would have survived ground bursts. At the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Colonel George Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group made the unauthorized decision to deploy proximity-fused shells 3 days before General Eisenhower gave formal authorization. The result stunned everyone who witnessed them. German prisoners described the attacks as quick, powerful bursts, for which there was simply no defense. General Patton wrote afterward that the new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. We caught a German battalion trying to get across the Sauer River with a battalion concentration and killed by actual count 702. He declared flatly that the funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us. The combination of time on target, rapid fire direction, and proximity fuses created artillery effects that German soldiers had never imagined possible. Shells that exploded above their foxholes. Barrages that arrived without warning. Fire that could shift across the battlefield in minutes as forward observers spotted new targets. The men who built this system began their work in peacetime, when the next war seemed distant and the lessons of the last war were still being absorbed. Major Carlos Brewer at Fort Sill in the late 1920s abandoned traditional methods and introduced centralized fire direction. Edwin Howard Armstrong patented frequency modulation in 1933 and donated his invention to the military. Daniel Noble at Galvin Manufacturing conceived the SCR-300 using FM technology when the Signal Corps originally requested an amplitude modulation design. The Louisiana maneuvers of August and September 1941, involving up to 470,000 troops maneuvering across thousands of square miles of Louisiana and Texas, tested these concepts at scale for the first time. Piper Cub aircraft flew thousands of sorties for artillery spotting, validating the concept of organic air observation that would prove decisive in combat. Forward observers practiced calling fire on simulated targets, while umpires evaluated the speed and accuracy of the response. The War Department approved organic field artillery air observation in 1942 as a direct result. The maneuvers also identified weaknesses in infantry armor cooperation and communications that would be addressed in training programs before units deployed overseas. Officers who served in Louisiana and learned from its lessons would lead divisions in Normandy 3 years later. The painful lessons of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 forced doctrinal reform. American forces, fighting their first major engagement against German veterans, had been badly mauled in part because air assets were parceled out to individual ground commanders rather than employed as a unified force. Italy became the laboratory where every innovation was refined under fire. At Anzio in January 1944, Captain John W. Oswalt focused 370 guns on a single target, including naval gunfire from American and British warships. By June 1944, every hard-won lesson converged on the beaches and hedgerows of Normandy. The German army that faced this system was, in many ways, still the army that had conquered France in 1940 and driven deep into Russia in 1941. Its tactics were sound, its soldiers were brave. Its commanders were experienced, but it fought with communications technology that would have been familiar to soldiers of 1918. Wire telephones, runners, flares, signal flags. Against an enemy that could mass the fire of hundreds of guns in 9 minutes. Against an enemy whose every infantry squad carried a radio capable of summoning destruction from miles away. Against an enemy whose fighter bombers orbited overhead waiting for targets identified from tanks on the ground. Against that enemy, courage alone was not enough. Fritz Bayerlein, who survived the destruction of his division and continued fighting until the war's end, captured what he had experienced in a single phrase. It was hell, he said. His descriptions of Operation Cobra remain among the most cited primary sources for that battle. The men of Panzer Lehr Division who survived July 25, 1944, carried that memory for the rest of their lives. The moonscape that had been their positions. The friends who died without ever seeing what killed them. The terrible efficiency of an enemy who could bring fire from the sky and fire from the guns together, as if guided by a single mind. The story of American radio coordination in World War II is not a story of wonder weapons or individual heroism alone. It is the story of a system, of how a democracy at war mobilized not just men and machines but ideas, turning technical innovation into battlefield dominance. It is the story of why the Wehrmacht, which had conquered a continent through superior tactics and aggressive leadership, found itself helpless against an enemy that could see everywhere, communicate instantly, and strike with coordinated devastation from every direction at once. It is, ultimately, a story about the power of connection in warfare, a lesson the modern world has absorbed so thoroughly that we sometimes forget it had to be learned at all. The innovations that destroyed Panzer Lehr did not remain confined to World War II. The Fire Direction Center became the standard model for artillery command and control in armies around the world. Every modern military that fields artillery uses some variant of the system developed at Fort Sill in the 1930s. Frequency modulation became universal for military communications and eventually for civilian radio broadcasting as well. The integration of air and ground forces that Quesada pioneered evolved into the joint terminal attack control procedures used by modern militaries. Today's joint terminal attack controllers, directing precision-guided munitions onto targets in real time, are the direct descendants of the forward observers who called fire from hedgerows and hilltops 7 decades ago. The industrial capacity that made this system possible also shaped the post-war world. The electronics industry that produced millions of radios and radar sets during the war pivoted to consumer products when peace came. Motorola, which had manufactured the SCR-300, became a leader in civilian mobile communications and eventually in cellular telephones. The quartz crystal production facilities that supported 1 million units per month during the war enabled the growth of consumer electronics in the decades that followed. The engineers who learned their trade building military radios went on to create the communication systems that connected the modern world. The infrastructure of the information age has roots in the military communications revolution of World War II, but the human element of this system deserves remembrance as well. The innovation was not merely technical. It was organizational, requiring new relationships between branches that had historically operated independently. It required training that turned procedures into instinct, so that forward observers could call fire while under attack without conscious thought about the process. It required trust between artillery and infantry, between ground forces and pilots, trust that had to be built through shared experience and mutual respect. It required leaders at every level who understood not just their own weapons, but how those weapons fit into a larger whole. The technology was essential, but the human systems that employed the technology were equally important. The 700 men who held Hill 314 at Mortain did not survive through firepower alone. They survived because Second Lieutenant Weiss called artillery through fog and darkness on targets he could only hear, adjusting fire by sound when his eyes were useless. Because Lieutenant Colonel Veman improvised resupply methods that kept the radios working when conventional supply was impossible, because sergeants and privates held their positions under fire so that the forward observers could continue their vital work. But perhaps the most important legacy was conceptual. The American approach to combined arms warfare, developed through painful trial and error from Fort Sill to Kasserine to Normandy, demonstrated that coordination could multiply the effectiveness of individual weapons beyond any improvement in the weapons themselves. A radio that let a single observer command the fire of hundreds of guns was more valuable than any improvement to the guns. A communication link between a tank commander and a pilot overhead was worth more than additional armor or firepower on either platform. The whole, properly coordinated, was far greater than the sum of its parts. This insight, purchased in blood during the Second World War, remains the foundational principle of modern military doctrine. This lesson shapes military thinking to the present day. Modern militaries invest heavily in communications, command and control systems, and joint operations because the experience of World War II proved that networked forces defeat uncoordinated ones, regardless of individual courage or tactical skill. The conflicts of the 21st century, with their precision-guided munitions and satellite communications, are fought by armies that trace their doctrines directly to the innovations tested in the hedgerows of Normandy. The German soldiers who learned to fear the crackle of an American walkie-talkie understood this reality before military theorists articulated it. They knew that sound meant death was coming, precise and overwhelming, within minutes. They knew that no foxhole was deep enough, no counterattack fast enough, no tactics clever enough to overcome the weight of fire that sound would bring. They had met the future of modern warfare. And they had learned, through blood and terror, why the crackle of a radio, that simple sound of a soldier communicating with unseen forces beyond the horizon, was the most terrifying sound on the battlefield.